morning, everyone. Welcome to the October 31st edition of the TimeformUS Forecast. I'm David Aragona here with my usual co-host Craig Mulkowski, and this is going to be the only Breeders' Cup episode of the podcast that we put out this week. We're recording a little bit earlier than we normally would, partly due to Craig's travel schedule, since he'll be heading out to the Breeders' Cup to take in the Friday and Saturday races in person. So I think, Craig, you're traveling tomorrow, so we're recording this on Tuesday afternoon, and I'm going to be up front, as I know you are too, that I have not nearly completed my Breeders' Cup handicapping. I still have a lot of work to do on the Saturday card. I'm pretty much finalized with the Friday Breeders' Cup races, so you'll probably get a sense of that as we go through talking about this, but we're going to make the best of this, recording this on Tuesday.
Yeah, and I'm kind of in the opposite situation. I've spent more time on Saturday than Friday, but part of our tagline, I think, when you go to Timeform US is that we're supposed to make the races easy to handicap. So it is pretty quick to go through these races. We're obviously familiar with most of the North American horses, so I think we're coming from a pretty good place. And, I think these are races you don't want to get too committed this early because, unfortunately, as we've seen today, things are still going to change even after we talk about these today because horses are going to scratch. It's invariably going to be some more defection. So you don't want to be too committed, but it's also just so many horses and so many big races that you do want to get a bit ahead of the game.
Yeah, we were initially going to record this morning. I probably at the time that unfortunate news was announced about the death on track of Practical Move, and also Arcangelo having that foot issue and him being declared out of the Breeders' Cup and subsequently retired. So, as Craig said, big news with regard to some defections. I think given the way this 2023 year has gone on the big weekends, we were almost expecting it, dreading it, and it came this morning. So you never want to have issues like that, especially like what we saw happen with Practical Move. But, if you follow horse racing for long enough, you know that tragedies like that are possible. So let's move on and talk about some of these races carded for Friday and Saturday. And Craig, I'm glad that you brought up Timeform US because there are some interesting things that I saw as I was handicapping these races in Timeform US, especially on Saturday going through. And we're going to discuss some of those. We're going to actually tackle our discussion from three angles as we go through it today, beginning with the pace projectors. We're going to talk about different pace scenarios for the Breeders' Cup races. Not all of them, but we're going to go through some notable ones on both Friday and Saturday. Some races that there are no early pace projectors for, and we'll discuss why that is. Some that we might agree or disagree with. So we'll discuss both of those days. Then move on to talk about favorites. We're going to discuss whether we believe any of the clear-cut favorites on both days are going to be vulnerable. I think we'll dissect them, not necessarily giving who all of our alternatives are in those races, because personally, for me on Saturday, I still have a lot of work to do to get to that final decision. But I do think you have to develop some early opinions about favorites, those that are going to take a lot of money in a few of these races to get to the next step. And then towards the end, we're going to discuss some long shots that we want to consider. For me, it's mostly going to be Friday races because those are the only picks that I finalized so far. Craig, it sounds like you might have more ideas on Saturday, so hopefully we can sort of fill in the gaps for each other.
Yeah, I think you have it right. For the long shots, I picked seven, so basically half the races, and six of them are going to come on Saturday.
Well, let's begin by talking about the pace of a few of these Breeders' Cup races, and we'll begin with the Friday races. And on the list that I sent you, Craig, I put 4 of the 5 races down. We're not going to talk about the Juvenile fillies turf because that one just looks very murky with a lot of European contenders in there. But I think pace is an important discussion point in all 4 of the other juvenile races on Friday, beginning with the turf sprint. And this is always a really tough one to read, Craig. There is no pace projector generated for this race, and I believe that's because half the runners have no pace data coming in from Europe. Obviously, when you watch the replays, a few of them do have quite a bit of early speed, and I think first and foremost among those is the number 4, Big Evs, who is listed as the morning line favorite. When you watch his recent victories in Europe, he's the kind of horse that goes to the front on those straightaway courses and just maintains his advantage throughout. But now he's getting to a 5-furlong tight turn Santa Anita course. We've got to see how he's going to handle that. And he's got a pair of George Weaver trainees to his inside that are pretty fast.
He does for sure, and no name Mets and Crimson Advocate, and There's a lot of speed in here. I'm usually a little hesitant to talk about speed in a 5 furlong race because a lot of times it doesn't matter and the speed of the speed will win. But I do think there is quite a bit in here. We also have speed drawn on the outside and Slider, a horse who switched to turf last time for the first time and showed the same kind of speed. Maybe not speed figure and pace figure wise as he had in his debut, but certainly quick enough to open up a clear lead, show some gameness. So, given just those four, and that's before we even talk about any of the other Euros, there just seems like there's a ton of speed in this race.
Yeah, it does feel like there's going to be a real scrimmage for the front end here. I mean, even a horse like the number 3 Tiger Bell has shown front running tendencies in her races overseas, and she's drawn inside, but right in between No Name Mets and Big Evs, it's hard to see that one getting to the front end, barring a poor break by some other horses. So it does. You would think that something has to give on the front end, and they don't run this distance that often at Santa Anita, just a flat 5 furlongs. Most of their turf sprints are either 6, 6.5, 5.5 sometimes, but they rarely run the 5 furlongs on the turf. One of our listeners was writing a comment on one of our recent podcasts that this distance might play a little more fairly than you would sometimes expect. But I was listening to some insight provided by our colleague Brad Free, who obviously follows the California circuit very closely. And Brad made a very good point that regardless of how these 5 furlong races play across the board, you really want to pay attention to the prior times, I think just a couple times that they've run this distance at the Breeders' Cup, because very rarely do they run the 5 furlongs when the rails are set at 0 feet, no temporary rail. And when the rails are set at 0 feet, it really seems like the race plays to speed. If you watch the 2 5 furlong Breeders' Cup races from 2019 at Santa Anita, both of them were won on the front end with basically no closing going on at all. So I think that's something you really do have to pay attention to, because there's the inclination to try to look for a closer in this race, and there are some closers with so much speed signed on, but I just wonder if they're going to be able to get the trip or even have the time to make up the ground going this distance.
Yeah, that's always the concern, and why I said I am leery to talk about pace in a 5 furlong race. It's interesting that you note that I'm not sure if the rails will be down. I mean, the rails will be down for the Breeders' Cup, of course. I don't know if they will be Thursday. They're running a card on Thursday, so hopefully they are. Maybe that'll give us a little indication, but it's just something you'll have to keep an eye out for because it's been quite a while since they've been at 0, and they've been as wide as I can remember the past couple weeks.
Yeah, and as we move on from this race, I'll just say I was all prepared to be against Crimson Advocate in this race because she's got a lot to deal with coming off the long layoff. But going back to review her races from earlier this season, I had kind of forgotten just how fast she was. I mean, she busted out of the gate in that race at Gulfstream. And when you watch the replays of those stakes races from Royal Ascot, it's interesting to note that Crimson Advocate ran in the Queen Mary on the exact same day and card that Big Evs ran in the Windsor Castle over the same 5 furlong distance and same course. And when you go and watch the videos of each of those races, they do provide the sectional times by furlong. And you could see in the first 3 furlongs of that race, Crimson Advocate leading through in a couple of sub 11 furlongs to begin the race, whereas Big Evs, I don't think threw in any of those. So definitely a slower pace to the Windsor Castle than there was to the Queen Mary. I think that's something important to note because we don't have pace figures for those horses.
Yeah, and I'd also note the final times were very similar. I think they were within a tenth of a second of each other, with Big Evans being just a little bit quicker. So if we did make pace adjusted figures, Crimson Advocate would almost assuredly have the higher one.
Let's move on to the Juvenile fillies on the dirt. That's the second Breeders' Cup race. And Craig, I put this on the pace rundown because I think Tamara is going to be a very heavy favorite, obviously, not going out on a limb there. And we're going to talk about her in greater depth when we get to the vulnerable favorites section, or potentially vulnerable favorites, question mark. She is a horse that does seem to like to be forwardly placed. She was pretty aggressive when you watch the replay of that Del Mar debutante. And this is a race that has quite a bit of speed in it, stretch out sprinters. I could see this pace getting pretty fast because a lot of horses that are going to be taking their shot against Tamara, they're going to be trying to do it getting ahead of her in the early stages. And I just wonder if the one vulnerability for her, and we'll talk about this again later, is if the pace gets too fast.
Yeah, we talk about a lot on our pace cast, especially when we review races, with a little consternation about how guys don't ride fast early anymore. They don't take shots against favorites, but I would like to think, and we've seen it mostly in the past, that that kind of goes out the window on Breeders' Cup Day. So when I saw the fast pace designation on this, I was first a little bit skeptical, having looked at the PPs of Tamara, and we have second shown as Chattelis. And they're not exactly speedballs that have all ones in their PPs. Tamara doesn't have any, but is stretching out for the first time. Chattelis didn't show any until she stretched out the 2 turns, but I think you make a good point. I would hope that some of these riders are going to get aggressive and go for it. Brightwork's another horse who's stretching out. She did try it once at Keeneland without a lot of success, but she had kind of a wide post that day. I'm not a fan of hers, but I would imagine the tactic for her would be to go to the front the way she backed up as well. So the more I dug into this, I tend to agree with the pace projector. I think it is going to get pretty quick up front.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just looking at horses like Jody's Pride, Omaha Girl, who showed speed at Gulfstream, including sprinting, Chattelis, the fact that she had her success on the lead. You've got to think they're going to be aggressive again. Brightwork, I mean, a horse who had shown speed sprinting, Accommodate Ava, who won gate to wire, sprinting in her last race. I don't think that these horses are contenders to win the race, but I do feel like to have their best chance, their connections have to be thinking they're going to get them somewhat forward. So I just wonder if this pace could really heat up. And we've seen in the past, you do get upsets in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile and Juvenile fillies when that pace just tips over the line a little bit and goes a little too fast, and you typically get the big prices when these races come apart, because you might have superior horses that just aren't able to win on the day, even if they have the most ability, because they're young, inexperienced, they don't have the seasoning and stamina, and sometimes a horse like Tamara, who's never tried 2 turns before, you might have the assumption that she's going to handle it, and over the long term, she might turn out to be a horse that's better going 2 turns, but this is a pretty tough scenario in which to try it for the first time in the Breeders' Cup with so many other horses that want to get the same trip that you do.
Yeah, and it's also a case where a lot of these horses have been running their good races in smaller fields where they just don't face a lot of pressure throughout the race, not just if they're not front runners. It's just you have more room, you have less mid-race moves, and now we're going to have a full field of 13. So as riders try to get better and better position or secure good position, that does tend to heat things up as well. So I think this one's going to be pretty fascinating early.
Now let's move on to the juvenile for the males. This one also on the dirt. And different situation here, Craig, because we've got some favorites that are proven over route distances, proven around 2 turns. So I don't think we have that same question to answer with regard to stretch outs. But there is still speed in this race. And I'm going to be interested to see how it plays out among 3 key players. And they're the 3 horses that are shown on the front end on the pace projector. Those are Wind Me Up, who seems like the quickest of the Bob Baffert horses early. When Bob Baffert has 3 horses in a race, you kind of figure at least one is going to get sent. General Partner, who's been most effective when he makes the lead, and he's arguably the most naturally fast of any of these. And then you've got Muth on the outside, who showed the ability to rate last time, but another horse who has plenty of natural speed and figures to be forwardly placed in this race. So this is a different sort of situation. I don't think that this is a race that has to fall apart. But, oh, and I'm sorry, the one other horse I wanted to throw into the mix was not Muth. I'm looking at the pace projector, but it's the number 9 Fierceness, who stumbled at, or I should say hopped at the start in the Champagne last time, didn't get a chance to be as forwardly placed as he was going to be, but he's kind of a real wild card with regard to the pace because we know that he possesses a lot of early speed. So like I was trying to get at, I don't know if this is a race that I'm projecting to completely fall apart, but it does feel like a few of those horses that want to get to the front are going to have an impact on the outcome.
Fierceness is the real wild card for me. I mean, if you watch his debut, you would think he's a horse who's going to want the lead. He had some issues last time, obviously, as you noted. Not sure that completely explains how poorly he ran afterwards, but maybe sometimes, especially in the slop, taking a lot of mud in his face, it's hard to say. I would expect, I don't know if he'll rebound to be a win contender, but I would expect him to join. Like if I was making a manual pace projector, I would swap him and Muth because Muth is a horse who, yeah, he won at 5 furlongs running away from the field. But he's shown he can rate in the last couple, including when he changed to 2 turns and beat Wind Me Up that day. So given his outside draw, I would expect that Juan Hernandez is going to be watching very intently what's happening inside of him and looking for a place to tuck in and maybe get a 2 wide trip around the turn.
Yeah, and Fierceness's position on the pace projector is based on the Champagne last time in equal part to his debut, and that's why he's not shown on the early lead. If he had not run the Champagne, and if you just sort of draw a line through it, he'd be shown ahead of these other horses on the pace projector, just given the early pace rating from his debut race. So that's definitely something to consider with him. Look, I don't like Fierceness at all in the race, but I do think he's going to have an impact on the outcome. And any pace that develops, Craig, I mean, it's going to suit the horse who's got the LP flag on the TimeformUS pace projector that's locked. So I think the connections of him would be happy to see some battling going on the lead. And obviously, Locked does not have common ownership with Fierceness. Actually, a different Rapoli horse noted on the outside is the one who's in the same stable and same owner as Fierceness. But I think Todd Pletcher will be happy to see Fierceness showing speed in this race for his horse that has the better chance.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And we'll talk about Noted later. Just a little spoiler alert. I'm going to bring him up towards the end of the show, but certainly a hot piece would help Todd Pletcher's favored locked in here. And uh, Chipping West, he certainly has shown that late kick. When he broke his maiden, he was up close, but that was kind of a slowish piece, overmatched competition. The Keeneland race was very good, particularly when you consider it was a short stretch.
Now, moving on to the Juvenile Turf, which will be the last pace situation that we discuss on Friday. This is one that I was starting to flag when I was going through the pre-entries and even before that, kind of looking out how all of the prep races were playing out, that there is not a lot of speed in this race. I mean, first of all, you go through the European contenders, decide to see if there are any hidden speed runners, and there doesn't appear to be. I mean, you've got the number 2, River Tiber, who's a stretch out from sprint races, but he's not really a speed type when you go and watch his races. And Craig, it just looks like the number 5, My Boy Prince, is going to be able to control this race on the front end, and I don't know who's going to really go after him in the early stages.
I agree with you. I mean, he's shown clear on the pace projector, and to me, even just as importantly, when you look who's shown second, it's the 13 Grand Mo the first, a horse who stretched out last time and was near the back of the field going 2 turns. He did show a little speed in synthetic sprints, but it's not like he's a horse that's shown a ton of speed. And shown third is Stay Hot, a long shot who was pressing just a moderate pace when he broke his maiden at Santa Anita. So I don't know if My Boy Prince is good enough to win, but he's certainly going to get every chance, in my opinion. The one horse I would be a little, you mentioned River Tiber. I won't be surprised at all if from his inside post, Ryan Moore doesn't keep him up pretty close. Not that he'll be on the lead or pressing, but if he was in the pace projector, I suspect he would probably be shown in the third or fourth position.
Yeah, the other horse that I could see being somewhat forward in here is the number 1, Air Recruit, who's coming out of a very fast-paced race at Laurel, and especially with Louis Size aboard trying to hold that rail position. I could see him going, but it doesn't feel like any of those horses are going to be intent on making the lead. I mean, it's pretty clear that My Boy Prince is the only front runner in this race, and we know he handles the turf. I'm going to bring him up again a little bit later, Craig, but I mean, he ran very, very well behind Carson's Run, who was done no favors by the post position draw here when he ran in that Summer Stakes 2-back. So I think it's an interesting angle to discuss and dig into a little further, and we'll get back there when we circle back to this race a little later in the podcast. Let's move on to Saturday, though, and spend some time talking about a few of these pace scenarios. And let's begin with the Dirt Mile, the first Breeders' Cup race of the day on Saturday. And obviously, this pace scenario, unfortunately, affected a little bit by the withdrawal, unfortunately, that terrible situation with Practical Move. I don't think it changes who was going to be in front, though, Craig. The number 4, Zozos, is shown on a clear early lead, and I think the only question with Zozos is how fast is he going to go. It does feel like he's going to be in front, though.
Yeah, hard to imagine he won't be. Again, another situation when you look at who's in second and third. We show Skippy Longstocking, who has been running longer distances. He did lead wire to wire at Charlestown last time, but that was over a wet track with all blue fractions, very slow pace. And before that, I mean, you have to scroll all the way back to when he broke his maiden a long time ago before he's shown in the lead. And Charge, it's another one who he's had some success on the front end, particularly in the Suburban, but that was at a mile and a quarter. This is a totally different situation. So for me, it's hard to see Zozos not leading the race. I don't know if I think he's good enough to win or not. I'm going to have to dig a little deeper into that, but I do think it could pose some problems for the favorite and horses that do want to come from behind. Maybe some others will get the jump.
Yeah, I'm definitely inclined to be against a horse like Zozos just based on the fact that he's coming off such a perfect trip victory in his last start, but I think you have to give him a second look, even if you were planning to be against him, just given the way this race is projecting to shake out on the front end. Because, I mean, Charge It, as you said, he's shown in that stalking position, but we know Charge It sometimes can't get out of the gate and sometimes can't get out of his own way. So I don't know how forward he's going to be in the race. National Treasure at times has shown speed on the outside, but I think the pace projector is capturing him a little further back because they've been rating him in recent races and drawing the outside. I don't know how they're going to ride him. And it does feel, especially given that short run into the clubhouse turn, that this pace could get back down a little bit more than we've seen in some recent Breeders' Cup Dirt miles, and that could affect a horse like Cody's Wish. We're going to obviously circle back to Cody's Wish when we talk about potentially vulnerable favorites, but I think it's something that you have to start the discussion with when we get there in the pace of the race.
Yeah, no doubt about it. It's one that I think there's some real question marks, and we have a very good shipper who in Algiers who ran second in the Dubai World Cup. He's shown up close before. He'll certainly be in front of the favorites in here. So I do think it's a pretty wild situation where I was really surprised it didn't show favors early. When I look through the preview page, I can see why. There's just a lot of horses labeled as trackers, meaning they will at least be within shouting distance, but it's pretty close to the favors early situation with Zozo's up there all by himself.
Now, the next race I put on the list, Greg, is the Breeders' Cup Mile, and it's mostly because this is a tough pace situation to read. The pace projector can only go so far because you've got a lot of horses with foreign running lines that are not going to have early and late pace ratings. So it kind of looks all jumbled and confusing, and you see horses like Astronomer, who does have speed, and Exalted is more of a stalking type, shown up on the front end, and it looks like a race that doesn't feature a whole lot of pace. But when you start to dig through it, I feel like this is a pace that might be more competitive than it appears at first glance. Especially because of the presence of the number 4, Win Carnelian, who, when you go back and watch his Japanese races, he's a frontrunner. He's gone to the lead in each of his last 2 starts over there, and if you know anything about racing in Japan, those are large fields, and it takes some doing to get to the front end in those races. So it feels like the plan is going to be to go forward with him, and based on the way that Maude ran in her U.S. start last time, and watching some of her prior races, she can get a little keyed up and aggressive in the early stages. I think they're also going to try to get forward with her, so I don't think it's going to be a free ride on the front end for a long shot like Astronomer.
No, I would agree. It's one where we don't show the pace projector if too many horses don't have data, but in this case, only 3 of them didn't. So we put one together, but it's just one of those situations where 2 of the 3 probably have good speed. Well, I guess Maj is on there since she did run here and has shown up front, but at least one, Win Carnelian, is one who has shown high speed. I went and watched those same races too. I don't know if he's a contender in here, but he's definitely got to go to the front. And just the fact that it's 14 horses over what's a tight Santa Anita course, it's almost guaranteed that there's going to be some horses making early moves and trying to get position. So it seems very unlikely that anybody would get away easy up front.
One thing that struck me about this pace projector, Craig, is the placement of Casa Creed, who is shown all the way up in 4th place. That's kind of surprising. I mean, you think of Casa Creed as more of a closing type, in some cases a deep closer in those turf sprints, but there are a lot of horses in this mile that want to come from even further back than him, particularly those 2 drawn in the outside slots. So maybe Casa Creed is a horse that's not going to be as far back as I thought he was going to be before handicapping this race. But like we were saying, there might be some shuffling from the way this pace projector looks, given some other speeds that are not showing on there.
Yeah, Casa Creed actually has not been very far off of pretty quick paces. All the pace figures in the 140s or at least 130s in his last couple races. And it's not like he's been way behind. And to me, that's not a big surprise because He's a horse who's shown success sprinting. Now he is further back early in those sprints, but it obviously takes more early speed to be in touch. So I won't be surprised at all if he gets a good stalking inside position.
Let's move on to the Breeders' Cup Distaff, which I think has been one of the most discussed and debated pace scenarios of this Breeders' Cup, especially on Saturday, because this is a race that definitely features some speed, Craig. And I've got to say, I wasn't necessarily even viewing the number one Hoosier Filly as part of that conversation, but here she is shown leading on the TimeformUS pace projector just barely. I mean, I think 5 horses have very similar TimeformUS early pace ratings, and we just kind of sort them by post position in that situation. But Hoosier Filly, she is adding blinkers for this race, and she's coming out of a race that featured an honest pace, so maybe she is going to be ridden forwardly in this race, even though I kind of would expect her to be in more of a stalking position. But I think the main protagonist, as far as the contest for the front end is concerned, would be Idiomatic, Adair Manor, and Randomized, and it's going to be interesting to see how each of those runners are ridden.
I think the blinkers make Hoosier Philly interesting pace wise. I don't like her in the race as a winner, but drawing the rail, she's a horse who's done her best running on the front end. I mean, the Cotillion, she was a couple lengths back, but that was against Ceiling Crusher. She would probably be shown on front in this pace projector had she been nominated to the Breeders' Cup. So I don't really have any problem with Hoosier Philly being on the front end. As for the others, they've been pretty quick. We have Idiomatic shown second, and I think of the main contenders, she's shown the most solid pace figures when you look at her running lines, particularly compared to Adair Manor and Randomized. So I won't be surprised at all if she's right there on the front end. Maybe she sits just off of Hoosier Philly, but I think she's the most naturally fast of the other contenders. Adair Manor, we've talked about her many times on the Pacecast. 4-1 surprised me on the morning line. She's been eating up on some pretty inferior competition out west. Feels like she's beat Desert Dawn about 25 times in a row. I know that's certainly nothing like that, but they just always run together, and I just don't think she's that good, even though she's in this field. And Randomized, the 3-year-old, I always wonder about horses like this. She was a horse I actually liked in the Alabama. It turned out well, but she's had things go her own way 3 times in a row now. A lot of blue fractions in the last race and the race 3 back, and then in the Alabama, she was pretty clear on a day that the rails seemed to definitely be the place to be. I mean, she ran fine, ran well, but of the speed horses, she's the one I have the least faith in.
Yeah, when it comes to sorting it all out and arriving at a pick in this race, I'm not there yet, but I think you do have to develop some opinions about how this race is going to develop on the front end, and whether 4 of them go, 3 of them go, or 2 of them go. It kind of feels like something's got to give in this race, because there are a few of these horses that really do need to be forward to have their best chance. So I'll be interested to see how it all plays out, and if the pace is quick enough to bring in some closers, potentially at bigger prices. I think this is one of the more wide open races of the Breeders' Cup. So more to come on this one, but it's definitely one of the more interesting Saturday races to handicap. Let's move on to the turf, and I'm trying to remember why I put the Breeders' Cup turf on our pace conversation. Probably because there's no pace projector for this race, Craig, and I think I just added all of those so we can at least discuss them. This is one of the more difficult pace situations to read without the pace projector, though I would say the number 6 Gets Smokin' is probably going to be the front runner in this race. I mean, he's just a horse that always goes to the lead, even over shorter distances. And the fact that he was able to handle the 1.5 miles last time at Kentucky Downs is the reason he's in this race. But it would be kind of hard to see somebody getting in front of him early.
Yeah, maybe Balladeer, the 12 horse. I mean, he's shown pretty quick pace figures the last couple at shorter distances. But I think the 2 of those horses in the race kind of assure that the pace is at least going to be solid. So I don't think anybody's going to have a pace excuse. And I think you can be pretty confident betting whatever horse you think is best without worrying too much about them not getting any pace to run into, or getting too much pace if they like to be up front, because I don't really see any of the contenders as that type of horse.
Yes, Craig, you're jogging my memory when it comes to why I put this race on the rundown. Yes, Balladeer also has speed, and it just For the Breeders' Cup Turf going the mile and a half distance, I mean, sometimes we see the pack get really bunched and it turns into this sprint to the wire. Sometimes the field gets kind of stretched out in this race. We've seen that happen a few times when American horses that have speed can go fast on the front end. Obviously, you think about years ago at Santa Anita and we saw Precious Passion do that. I don't think there are any Precious Passions in this race, but I mean, we saw Highland Reel break the race open one time in California. Over those harder turf courses, sometimes when you have a horse that can sort of make a breakaway move or stretch the field out, it can create a situation where a few of the riders can get caught off guard. So I think you want to pay attention to where some of these horses could be placed in the early stages and whether it turns into a real true test of stamina, because that could be a factor for a horse like Up to the Mark, who's never gone this far before and has that sprint finish, but you wonder if he can produce it if they go quickly up front.
Yeah, that's a good point. We just don't know. He's done it at shorter distances. He's handled very fast paces, but you just don't know at a mile and a half. But as I said, we haven't really talked about any of the Euros. I did none of them stuck out to me as horses who had to be up near the front or anything. I would be pretty rare at a mile and a half, but I definitely think we're going to have speed with the two pace setters we mentioned. So should be an interesting one and just a race where the best horse wins.
Yeah, Mostadov has tactical speed, not as fast early as a horse like Get Smokin' in all likelihood. And Bolshoi Ballet at different times has been used as more of a rabbit type in Europe, but given the way he won the Sword Dancer last time, I'd imagine he's not in here as a rabbit anymore. So I wouldn't be expecting those horses to get sent to the front end. Let's move on to the Breeders' Cup Classic. It's not the last race of the day of the Breeders' Cup on Saturday this year, but it's definitely the one that has the most anticipation building towards it. Unfortunately, some of that dissipates a little bit with Arcangelo being withdrawn from the race and unfortunately retired. And it does feel like we've lost a few players in this Classic division, Craig. There was the injury to Go Rocket Ride earlier in the week. That's the most obvious defection. But even before that, we lost a few players both in the older horse division, 3-year-olds that have fallen by the wayside. So it's not the strongest classic from a talent standpoint, but it still shapes up as a wide open race.
No doubt. Now we have a field of 12 now. We have plenty of horses who have shown speed. I found the pace projector interesting in this case because we do show it as a race with the red flag for a fast pace. But when you look at the top three, they're pretty spread out, and particularly the top two for me, showing that spread was interesting because Arabian Night, he's a horse who we just saw win wire to wire in the Pacific Classic. And then Saudi Crown, who just won the Pennsylvania Derby wire to wire. Both have done it not setting blue fractions. They're running pretty fast pace figures. So I think it could be interesting. And I would be surprised if Arabian Night, Flavian Pratt aboard, would let Saudi Crown be that much clear early on, because that could be a pretty dangerous situation chasing him.
Yeah, there is not an abundance of speed in this classic. I know that's a little counterintuitive given the fast-paced flag on the pace projector, Craig, but I mean, beyond those, it feels like the three horses shown towards the front end are going to be the three horses that are first, second, third early in some order. Saudi Crown, Arabian Night, and White Barrio. But when you get back to that next tier of runners, those are not horses that need to be forward. I mean, Zandon and Proxy are in that next flight. I mean, they're not going to be pressing the pace. So it does feel like if one or two of Arabian Night or White Barrio decide to back off in the early stages, I could see a scenario where Saudi Crown gets to slow down this pace a little bit. I don't know if he's going to go 48 to the half, but this is not a classic where I think they're going to be absolutely blazing a trail up the backstretch.
Yeah, I can see that. I guess it's just a matter of if nobody else goes, and Arabian Night could just sit and kind of play watchdog on Saudi Crown, who I would say probably has some distance questions. I won't say limitations because we really don't know at this point, but it's definitely a situation where, you don't want to go out there if you're the only two speeds and knock each other out. So I wouldn't think the riders would go crazy, but it's hard for me to envision one letting the other steal it.
The wild card in this pace projector for the Classic would be Derma Sotogake, because obviously his position on the pace projector is only based on his Kentucky Derby, where he got off to a poor start and was sort of always out of the position they wanted him to be in. he had shown speed when he won the UAE Derby, leading from gate to wire in the prior start. I remember way back when you did some pace figures for that race, correct? And he was shown pretty close up towards the front end on the Kentucky Derby pace projector. So he definitely has some early speed. I just wonder if they're going to use it and kind of wonder what we're going to get from him off the long layoff. But he's a horse that I think you do have to at least mention as one that could throw a monkey wrench into what's been predicted among the other runners.
Right, we have him shown next to last, and you mentioned why. I mean, he broke slowly, had some gait issues in the Derby, and he was in the latter half of the field. Didn't really run that day. A lot of questions about this horse. It just seems a super tall task to come off a long layoff like this of 6 months. Had a setback. He was scheduled for a prep, so not only as a win contender, it makes you wonder pace wise, but they're sending him here, and I've been watching the works. The reports are fine for him, so I would imagine if he's there, he's going to try to go. Now, whether he can keep up with the others, that I don't know.
And let's close out our pace discussion with the final Breeders' Cup race of Saturday. That is the sprint. And Greg, it feels like this has become a theme with Grade 1 sprints, and I thought we were going to avoid it in the Breeders' Cup sprint, but yet another favors frontrunner's designation in a Grade 1 dirt sprint in the United States. I mean, years ago, you would have never thought you'd see the day when that would be the case, but it just feels like it's unavoidable this year, and again, that's what we've got. I could see this one playing out a little more competitively than it showed on the pace projector, but it's not like any of the three horses that are shown vying for the lead, Dr. Scheibel, Hoist the Gold, and Speedboat Beach, none of them are necessarily need the lead types.
No, not at all. I mean, we've seen them all run well from off the lead and do just fine. So I think it's just going to come down to tactics. Though the one thing I'm pretty confident in saying in here is I would not want a closer. And I say that knowing full well that Elite Power is kind of a closer, though he can stay up close when the pace is slow. But he's a horse who's also going to be a short price. He's beaten me before in these situations, and maybe he will again. I haven't gotten around to really handicapping and sending my picks into DRF, but just my first thought when I looked through this field was, they're not going to go very fast, so it's going to have to be a pretty good ride from our Rad Ortiz to not let this horse get too far out of it, because I imagine that last furlong is going to be really quick for a sprint time.
Well, and from here, Craig, we're just going to pivot to the next section of our rundown, which is vulnerable favorites. And I think we're going to go in reverse chronological order, starting where we just left off with Elite Power in the Breeders' Cup Sprint, because it does feel like he's going to be the favorite in this race based not just on reputation, but also his 2023 accomplishments. I mean, he's won a couple graded stakes races, has that Grade 1 win of the distance in Saratoga over main rival Gunite, but he's a horse that hasn't gotten a lot of pace this year, and we saw that worked his detriment last time when he was beaten by that rival. And looking back, the last time that he got that red color-coded pace figure in his PPs was last year's Breeders' Cup Sprint, and he was able to win that day with just a mediocre 116 Timeform US speed figure for this level, I should say. 116 is a good number, but you expect the Grade 1 Breeders' Cup Sprint to get a higher winning figure than that, and it just feels like Elite Power is not going to get the kind of setup that he got last year, and really not the kind of setup that he wants under ideal circumstances.
No, it's interesting. That red fraction he got is the only one he's ever been involved in his career, and he was able to take advantage. But when you look at this race, it's just hard to see things not playing out similarly. I mean, Elite Power's never run particularly fast. His fastest speed figure came in the Vanderbilt over a sloppy track, and that was a race where we gave a pretty big pace upgrade. It wasn't an easy day to make speed figures, and his time form rating when he won over in Saudi was good, but outside of that, he runs right around the 120 mark, and that's actually what the race rating is for this race, so I definitely consider him vulnerable.
Craig, when I look at this race, can't you just envision Speedboat Beach just blasting off to the front and opening up on this field? I know they didn't ride him that way last time. That was off a long layoff. They probably didn't want to kill him coming off the layoff. He was ridden a little conservatively. But now he's switching to Mike Smith, who, for Bob Baffert, he typically lets the speed horses roll. Can't you just envision this horse going to the front and not looking back?
I think that's what they should do, but I'm a speed guy, so that's what I always think. I think I actually mentioned that last week when we saw the pre-entries that I would be surprised. I think they were a little conservative last time. They probably were thinking they wanted to make sure he got into this race, though it turned out the field's not big enough to really matter. But he wasn't ridden as aggressively as you'd think. But with a couple $1 million on the line now, and the change to Mike Smith. I think that will be the tactic because when you look at the PPs for Dr. Scheibel and Hoist the Gold, who is that they're just not that fast, and I see no reason he can't take it. And we haven't mentioned Gunite, the horse who has kind of been a little bit of a nemesis for Elite Power. At least he was in the Forgo, where he went wire to wire. But I'm just not sure he's quick enough to really run with the horses that we do have shown in front of him, even though, I mean, he is a grade one winner sprinting in New York. I just, that's to me, it was more circumstance. He took advantage of a weak field and a mean rival in Elite Power not having speed. So he's also disappointed at Park since going 2 turns. But even if you want to put a line through that, I'm just not sure how his best race would fit in here.
I think you're being a little dismissive of Gunite, Craig. I mean, his position on the pace projector, I think, is a function of those ridiculously slow paces at Saratoga where nobody went and there was just a strangle fest. He's naturally a lot faster than that. And I think if you go back to some of his previous races, he's a horse that is capable of being more forward in a race like this. And especially given the fact that there aren't that many speeds signed on, I mean, I would say he's as fast as Dr. Scheibel in the early stages. So I'm not going to be surprised if he's more forwardly placed. And being drawn outside, I think Tyler Gaffalione is going to have the opportunity to gauge what others are doing. And it's pretty easy to make an excuse for his last race. So I'm definitely not writing him off by any means.
Yeah, I shouldn't have said I'm rating him. I'm writing him off as a front end contender. He would have to adapt to coming from off the pace, in my opinion.
Well, I put Idiomatic in the Distaff next on the rundown as a favorite to discuss, and I guess she is going to be sort of a clear-cut favorite in here, Craig. I'm not really sure who else they're going to bet. I mean, I could see Clairiere taking quite a bit of money just given the pace scenario of this race that everyone's talking about. But still, I mean, she's got that poor effort showing last time where she was easily beaten by Idiomatic. So it does feel like Idiomatic is going to be the clear favorite in this race. It's just, I wonder if she's the kind of horse that you could really trust at a short price. Though, I guess you could say, Craig, and I'll throw this question to you, do you think she is the most trustworthy of those that want to be forward?
I do. That's what I mentioned on the pace projector. I mean, I certainly trust her more than Hoosier Philly. Adair Manor, I don't think she's been running all that fast and beating up on inferior competition. And randomized just has all those blue fractions. So I'm not saying I love her in this race, but I can see her being a legitimate favorite. I mean, she's not a horse I would want to single because things could go easily wrong with all the speed drawn in. But I do think she's pretty trustworthy in here. And I mean, she's just been in great form all year long, really, and particularly since she switched to dirt.
Now, getting back to the Breeders' Cup Mile, when we were discussing the pace situation, we did mention one of the Japanese horses, Win Carnelian. We did not mention the number 10 Songline, who is the one that is going to attract the bulk of the attention and is arguably the most likely winner of the Japanese contingent coming over for this Breeders' Cup. And this mile, Craig, was a race that felt like it was coming up really strong a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about horses like Paddington and Up to the Mark being in here, among others, who were declared for this race and then subsequently withdrawn. And it just feels like the mile has gotten a little bit weaker than it initially looked. And it just does feel like Songline, who is undisputably one of the best, or maybe the best miler in Japan. She's a multiple Group 1 winner over there, or she's a Grade 1 winner over there. Just feels like she's the horse to beat in this race. But when you've got these horses coming from different continents, different form lines, all converging, how much confidence do you really have that she is going to play out as the best on the day?
Yeah, I don't have a lot. I mean, she wouldn't shock me if she won, obviously. I think she'll run okay. I don't think the post draw did her any favors, but I do think there's some questions. I mean, she's hasn't run only once since June. She lost in that comeback. Assuming that was just the prep, even you could look back to her race in Saudi, where she was nowhere near Casa Creed, who's in this field. I don't remember the trip that day. It's certainly something I'll go back and watch, but I just don't think she's a standout like we've seen some others come over, like Modern Games was last year. I think she fits in this field, and somebody has to be the favorite. So I get it being her, but I think she's far from a cinch.
Yeah, it is a little hard to rate her form compared to some others in here, and you do bring up the two Saudi Arabian races. She did beat Casa Creed in Saudi Arabia in 2022 when he went over there, and she was just able to get the best of him by a neck when he was trying to close her down at the very end. This year, she put an uncharacteristically dull effort that day. I don't believe she got the best trip, but she was just sort of always out of position and never looked like herself. She's been just unstoppable in Japan this year. In her prep race last time, in that 9 furlong event at Tokyo, you could make the argument she should have won because she was held up in traffic for a long way. Probably didn't run quite as well as the third place finisher Schnellmeister, who her main rival from Japan, who had even more traffic to deal with. But the two of them are the best milers in Japan, and it does feel like that form has been pretty strong over the past several seasons. When you have a top-level Japanese horse compete internationally in a different continent, they've generally done quite well, so I'll be interested to see how she does. I wonder how short a price is really fair on her, though, just given some of those concerns and the fact that she is drawn in that farther outside post position. A favorite that I think looks pretty solid, Craig, and I imagine we're going to kind of agree on that, is Goodnight Olive in the filly and mare sprint. Obviously, this race suffers from Echo Zulu not participating either here or in the Breeders' Cup sprint with the unfortunate injury that she suffered. And Goodnight Olive, I know that at different points this year she's looked vulnerable, but now coming into this race, seeing who she's facing, it just feels like she is very much the one they've got to get around.
Yeah, I'd agree. I mean, when you look at her speed figures, the only horse really close on Timeform US is Society. Talked about her a little bit on Tuesday. I don't think she's a horse that handles pressure very well, and I would imagine from the inside, Goodnight Olive is going to have to apply it sooner rather than later. So I think Goodnight Olive is a pretty big standout in this race. There's just nobody else really in her league outside of Society. When you look at the numbers, we do have a Japanese horse coming over who is definitely a wild card. Not in very good form though, has never tried dirt, so I tend to dismiss that one. Maybe at my own peril, but there's just nothing I saw watching her races that made me think she's a dirt horse. And when I look at the others, it's just Goodnight Olive's race to lose.
Yeah, I mean, Society is the one that has the figs that make her the main rival to Goodnight Olive, but so, when you start to take apart Society, Craig, she's got those big wins, 4 of them. 2 of them are at Charlestown. One is at Ellis Park when she was probably riding a big speed and rail bias. And then she's got the Cotillion at Parks. And the Cotillion was a legitimate effort, but she is a little bit of an in and out kind of horse. And she's a horse, like you were saying. I mean, she had perfect trips in those slow paced Charlestown races when she ran those big figs. So can she do it at this level in a faster paced situation? I'm not sure, and I'd imagine the horse that's going to really hound her early is, well, maybe one of two, the number 3 Ida, or the number 2 Clearly Unhinged, who both of them are coming out of a fast-paced race in the Chillingworth. They have early speed. Ida's speed was not utilized that day like it has been some points in the past, and I would imagine Bob Baffert's going to want to get back to more aggressive tactics, so I would imagine Goodnight Olive and Irad Ortiz is going to be happy to just take back out of the starting gate, try to wheel to the outside and run from that mid-pack or stalking position. But I think that she has the luxury to do that because there is enough speed in this race and she just seems like the best horse coming in.
Yeah, and we didn't mention Monterey. I think she has some speed as well. She beat Goodnight Olive early this year. Obviously, watching that race, it's a trip where Goodnight Olive just had absolutely nowhere to go. Got boxed in behind Wicked Halo and Monterey. But I do think she's one who could be a pace contender as well, even though she's shown a little far back on the pace projector.
In the filly and mare turf, I think we're going to have a pretty clear-cut favorite in here. I know it's close on the line, but I've got to imagine that Inspiral is going to be the clearly defined favorite in this race because she is just at her best, a cut above the competition that she's facing here. It probably would have been the case if they had gone in the Breeders' Cup Mile as well. I mean, she is really good. She doesn't. She's thrown in a few clunkers at different points. You could probably make excuses for those races. The big question with her, Craig, is the stretch out to the mile and a quarter because she's been such a mile specialist throughout her career. She's never gone beyond the mile. I think you can have some confidence that the Euros can get this distance, especially at a track like Santa Anita, where part of the race is run down the hill.
Yeah, I was listening to the Breeders' Cup breakfast at the Breeders' Cup this morning, and I think it was John Gosden they interviewed, and he was talking about choosing between these two races, and he just said that American racing is different, and they don't think the 10 furlongs will be any different. If I'm playing horizontal bets in here, there's no way I'm not using her because she just makes a lot of sense. When we get to the long shots, I'll talk about another horse that I would that I might use as well and maybe even bet, but I have nothing negative to say about Inspira.
Yeah, her last couple of races were really impressive, and it just feels like she's coming into this in razor sharp form. I think they did the right thing this year by not going to the Champions Day card at Royal Ascot, or Ascot, I should say, would it just have not suited her given the ground. She's much better on firm going, and a firm course, 10 furlongs. I'm not viewing that as a major negative with regard to her, but like you said, there are some other interesting runners in this race, so we'll get to that in just a little bit. Let's go back to the first Breeders' Cup race of Saturday, the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile and Cody's Wish. And we talked about a little bit, Craig, with regard to the pace, how it doesn't seem like there's that much of it in here. Cody's Wish did get a hot pace to close into when he won the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile last year, and he's generally been a horse that does best in these shorter races, particularly the one-turn mile distances or 7 furlongs, because he gets more pace in those races, and it might not be the case in this Dirt Mile, and I wonder if he can overcome it at this stage of his career, because I do think there's a question as to whether Cody's Wish is quite as sharp now as he was when he won the Met Mile during the summer.
I would agree with that. And just looking at his last two races, I know the Whitney was at 9 furlongs. Um, I just didn't like what I saw from him that day. He did bounce back sort of in the Vosburg. He was able to get the win over Accretive, and it's a race. It's kind of hard to know what to make of it. We gave it a pace upgrade. It only got a 112 final time rating, but that was because of the slow pace. Accretive just set a crazy slow pace on the front end, but we haven't seen a whole lot out of the horses in that race. Allen, who actually was last, came back to win. The others have ran fine, but they've just kind of validated their speed figures out of that one. So I have no problem with anybody that thinks maybe Cody's Wish isn't quite the same horse he was last year, and he's going to have to deal with what appears to be very little pace.
Yeah, he's a horse that I do think might be better around the one turd. I think that's a distinction you could make with him. And I do worry about the pace of this race. I mean, and I also worry that in his last few starts, he's broken a little bit slowly. It's happened 3 times in a row. And I think lacking that early speed and having that tendency to get off about a length behind the field, it just makes him have to be better to win this race. And this is not a vintage edition of the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. And I was kind of disappointed to see how the field came up, and even more disappointed after that unfortunate situation with Practical Move, who seemed like a real viable alternative in this race, that it might not be the opportunity to play against Cody's Wish that I was hoping it would be, because there's not a clear equal in terms of ability, or near equal. But that doesn't mean that he's not still worth playing against, Craig, because he's going to be a prohibitive favorite. There are horses in this race that could slip through the cracks. I think you started to bring up an interesting one earlier in the number 7, Algiers, who is a bit of a wild card in this race, has dirt form from overseas that can stack up fairly well here. I wonder what kind of trip he's going to get, how much speed he can show over the flat mile. I mean, Skippy Longstocking, a horse I never really thought of as being this good, but maybe he's going to fall into the right kind of trip here. And, we're circling back to Zozos, who is the horse that seems to have that big pace advantage. It's not like he's never run a fast race before. He's just, his last race is a little bit lackluster from a speed figure standpoint. But I think this is a kind of race where you want to keep an open mind and try to hold out for that value.
Yeah, and just a point I want to make generally about the Breeders' Cup is I want to keep an open mind on all these races because they're full of good horses. Favorites generally tend to get over bet. It doesn't mean we can't turn around and have a chalk fest where over bet favorites win a lot of the races, but we only get these opportunities a couple times a year. So very rarely am I going to focus in on favorites.
I completely agree with that. And let's move on to one race on Friday that is going to have a probably the biggest favorite of the Breeders' Cup. And that, of course, is Tamara in the Juvenile fillies. What price is she going to be, Craig? I mean, I know it's a 13 horse field, but couldn't she be 2 to 5 in here? I could even see her being 1 to 5. I mean, it just feels like so many are just conceding this race to her, and I kind of get it because she's just got such a standout on speed figures from her last race. But I will say she is trying the 2 turns route distance for the first time, and even though she's bred for it, and even though she looks physically like a horse that's supposed to handle it, she still has to do it. And I feel like the assumption that she's just going to do it is built into that really short price. And those are often situations when you want to try to look elsewhere.
Yeah, I don't know what to do with her. I'll probably try to beat her because, as you said, I mean, she's going to be a short price. If I had to guess her price, I think she'll be right at that 4 to 5 morning line. Just on a big day like this, it's usually some long shots that get over bet. It gets skewed from what we're used to on a Monday to Friday basis, but she's going to be the heavy favorite. It's tough to get past that speed figure last time, except when I pulled up the chart and started looking through the run backs, and literally all the horses that have run back have regressed, and several of them quite notably. Chattelis, who's in this field, did win her next start out, but her speed figure regressed 6 points. Everybody else has regressed quite a bit more, so you wonder how strong that race really was. And there's other questions. Not sure who I would look to beat her with, but almost a certainty that I will look to beat her just because of all the questions and the short price. Almost everybody else is going to have to be a pretty big price.
Yeah, I was going to make that exact same point about the Del Mar debutante, Craig. Not that the figure should be 20 points lower. We're not saying that. But even though she won impressively, and even though it got a big fig, I mean, even at the time, you gave that fig the F notation, which, if you don't know, and you're a TimeformUS speed figure user or TimeformUS PP user, Craig will assign letter code ratings to a few speed figures that he lacks some confidence in. And when you go in TimeformUS, the new TimeformUS on DRF.com, and you click on that speed figure, it brings up an explanation of what that speed figure notation means. And you can see in this situation, when you click on it, Tamara's 116F, that the F means it was a situation where there were a ton of either firsters or lightly raced horses in the race, and it was really tough to make a speed figure that made sense. And it's possible that in retrospect, that number is a little bit high. I don't think we're going out on a limb to say that she was beating nothing in these California races, Craig. I mean, there was just, I know Chattelis came back to win a stakes, like you said, but this is not a good crop out in California among the 2-year-olds, except for Tamara. So this is a big test for her. It does feel like sort of everybody's alternative if they're trying to beat her is Candide. I don't know. She's okay. She has not run particularly fast as nobody else has in this race. She looked a little green last time in the Alcibiades, but I'm somewhat bothered that Vivi's Dream came back to run so poorly last week at Churchill. I know it was a wet track, but you do wonder about the quality of that race a little bit as well. You know, Craig, I didn't think I was going to pick this horse, and people are going to accuse me of being the New York bias guy. I didn't think I was going to pick this when I started handicapping the race, but it just feels like nobody likes Just FYI in this race. And I think she's going to be every bit of that 8 to 1, if not higher. And to me, she still has all the upside in the world. I know that she too has beaten nothing, but I really like the visual of both of her races. She's this big, leggy thing who looks like she's still growing into her frame. I loved the workout that I saw from her recently at Santa Anita. And yeah, she's got to get faster. But if Tamara, let's say her Del Mar debutante fig should be a 110 instead, and let's say that she gets into a fast pace, doesn't handle the distance as well as everyone's assuming she does, and she regresses to a 105, well, suddenly that opens the race up to a lot of horses, including Just FYI, who I think has as much upside as anybody in here, and she's going to be the right price.
And it's when you look at her running line, I mean, it's all blue fractions. And with younger horses, I always wonder that generally tends to hold the speed figures back. So I do wonder if she's got a forward move in her. Just to circle back to Tamara a little bit, I pulled up the worksheet, and I'm pretty sure my assistant did this. He does like 99% of the Southern California races. But when you look at it, there were a ton of dirt sprints that day. But the 10th race kind of stood out as faster than all the others based on our projections. He didn't want to break it out, which I definitely would not have either, given that they're lately raced 2-year-olds. But you could easily make a case as I look at this worksheet that that race could have been a good 10 points slower.
And I think that's something that's really important to note about a horse that is going to be almost everybody's single on Friday. That's going to take a ton of money. I do think she's going to be shorter than 4 to 5. It just, this horse has such a following. I mean, she's the daughter of Beholder. This is a horse that everyone's looking forward to seeing on this day. And I do think she's going to take a ton of action. So we'll see how it all plays out. But if you can beat her in any of these sequences going through the Juvenile fillies, you're going to get paid.
Yeah, and that said, if she does win and I bet against her, I'll be just fine because Beholder's probably one of my 3 or 4 all-time favorite horses.
Well, yeah, I think we have to make that distinction, Craig. I mean, we love to make scores on these days. We love to find the right prices, but we also love to see great performances. And I mean, you don't want all these Breeders' Cup races to come up with disappointing speed figures or open races that long shots win and lackluster editions of them. I mean, you do want to see the stars come out while trying to find the right prices. So no one's going to be upset if Tamara smashes this field.
No, and I mean, heck, I was the guy that picked against Flightline in the Pacific Classic last year, and nobody was more excited than me to sit down and make the speed figure that day when he crushed the field by 20 lengths.
Well, Craig, let's give people a taste of where we're leaning in some of these Breeders' Cup races. Like I said at the start, I still have a ton of work to do on Saturday. I'm not close to making picks yet on Saturday, so I'm not going to give out the kind of hardened opinions that I typically do on a TimeformUS Forecast for Saturday. I've got my Friday opinions for the Breeders' Cup pretty much set at this point, but I will say, and we'll just do the shameless plug right now, I am writing Breeders' Cup betting strategies this week with Brad Free, who obviously is so dialed into Southern California racing, and Brad, if you follow his picks, had a very high strike rate at Del Mar this summer. He's somebody who is just really sharp when it comes to finding the winners of races, especially in Southern California. So I'm interested to discuss those races with him in writing. You get those betting strategies as part of the any of the DRF Breeders' Cup packages, whether it be the TimeformUS package or Formulator or the All Access package. So you can check out all of that stuff on DRF.com. Craig and I will have out some video previews. We'll be recording them later today. We'll do a video around the Classic and one around the Juvenile. So something to check out on DRF's YouTube channel, as well as all of the other great content from our fellow analysts, Dan Illman, Mike Beer, and others. So just want to give everybody a heads up about a lot of stuff that's going on over at DRF.com and on DRF's YouTube channel as far as handicapping content goes. Craig, I'll start first with the Friday races, since it sounds like I did a little more work on Friday so far compared to you. In the Juvenile Turf Sprint, I'm hoping for a scratch, but I'm not hoping for a scratch because you don't want to see more of these horses be withdrawn. But there is a horse on the also eligible list that I'm very intrigued by, the number 13 Hedwig, who looks a little inferior on speed figures, but when you go and watch this horse's races, this is a good horse. I mean, the debut race at Ellis was extremely impressive. This horse traveled so well into the race on the far turn, easily ran by the field and held off some closers that included Committee of One, who is drawn right inside him in the starting gate. Is coming off a prep win in the Indian Summer. So that's a legitimate race from Hedwig. And then he just got into the wrong situation last time at Kentucky Downs, got into a speed duel with a Wesley Ward horse that he put away and sort of won the battle, but lost the war that day as it fell apart at the end. I think this is the kind of horse that is handy enough to travel into the race from an outside post. And I know the post 12 or whatever he gets if he draws in is going to be disadvantageous, but he's going to be a huge price in here. So if there's a scratch, pay attention if Hedwig draws into this race. But I was having trouble coming up with any clever long shots in the main body of the field. I think Give Me the Beat Boys is a little bit interesting, though, only if the race comes apart a little bit and he can have the tactical speed to stay forward, because he's not a leader, but he's sort of a mid-pack stalking type, and I just worry he might not have the quickness to win going this distance. I already mentioned the Juvenile fillies. I did pick Just FYI. I just feel like she's going to be the right price compared to what I believe are her chances of winning. Tamara is probably 5 times more likely to win the race than just FYI, if not a little bit more than that. But Tamara's price is going to be 1/10 of that of just FYI, if not even less. So I just feel like that's a value situation where I've got to go for the bigger priced horse. In the Juvenile fillies turf, I think there's an interesting horse in here that I'm not sure what price she's going to be. But the number 7 Gala Brand is a horse that did not get the right setup last time in the Miss Grillo. That was a race that doesn't have any blue color-coded pace figures, but it really didn't feature very much pace, and hard to justify. Is going to take money coming out of there. I think she's kind of a last time as the time horse. I mean, she was a price that day and off a better than it looks debut, and she got a perfect trip and ride from an inside post from Flavian Pratt. But Gala Brand was just never in the right spot. She was taken to the back of the pack, always out of position, was really running at the end of that race, but that race just didn't go to closers. She had done really well in her prior start, closing into a slow pace, beating Carson's Run, who definitely is not without a chance in the Juvenile Turf on the same card. And I wonder if off that poor result last time, if she's just going to slip through the cracks a little bit. And this is one of those pace scenarios that's really tough to read. I don't know how far back she's going to have to be in the early stages to find a right trip, but we've seen Jose Ortiz work out last to first victories in this race before, just going back a couple of years to Pizza Bianca. So Gala Brand is a price horse in the Juvenile fillies turf that I'm very interested in. And before I finish it up, Greg, I'll throw it back to you to see if you have anything on those races.
No, I was just looking forward to hearing him. I mentioned the one I had on Friday. I'll just go ahead and cover him real quick. And uh, as to your package, the Breeders' Cup package you're doing, not package, but your handicapping you're doing, yeah, with betting strategies with Brad Free. I'll just mention that the first thing my wife Elsie always asks me when the Breeders' Cup stuff comes out is when do we get the betting strategies? She doesn't care about any of my stuff, or she just says I want David's picks. So, yeah. Some of that's tongue in cheek, but not all. She does always look forward to that. So the one horse I am focusing in on Friday is a horse I'm going to play in vertical bets. Not necessarily to win, though I'll certainly have at least a little bit of money on him. Is a horse I mentioned earlier, and that's actually Noted, the other Todd Pletcher, I believe it is in the Breeders' Cup Juvenile. And I just think he's a horse that really could slip through the cracks. He's only run once on dirt when he won at Monmouth Park, beating Dornoch, and a horse I know you're a fan of. A horse who since won very well, breaking his maiden. And Noted is just a horse that I think is a lot better than what his figures indicate. And I'm not convinced that even though he's run 3 out of the 4 times on turf, that he's not better on dirt. He had some excuses not to run quite so fast last time when on the dirt when he got an 89, winning that Sapling Stakes. And I just think, as we talked about, this is a race that the pace could get pretty hot. I wish he hadn't drawn the 11 hole. I would have been really enthusiastic about him if he had not, but I just think he's a horse that is a lot better than he looks on paper.
Yeah, I'm interested in him just for the sheer fact that they went to this race, Greg, because they could have gotten into the Juvenile Turf, and I believe the Juvenile Turf was the first preference for them on the pre-entries, and here he is in the Juvenile, and I kind of get it, because this is the race where he might be able to pick up some pieces if things do really heat up, because he's that closing type, kind of like Locked, and he hasn't yet proven to be as good as Pletcher's other closer, Locked, but you make some valid points about that Sapling being maybe a better race than it looked at the time, given the subsequent effort of Dornoch. I will say I watched Noted's last workout, which was in company with Fierceness at Keeneland, and to my eye, Noted was going a little better than Fierceness in that workout, which is very surprising because Fierceness was such a buzz horse based on his workouts early in the season. And I wonder if maybe Fierceness has gone a little bit the wrong way since that frustrating Champagne try. But I still think it's a good sign that Noted worked so well with him. And also interesting that Irad Ortiz, who seemingly have the choice, is not on Fierceness. He's on Noted. So I just think some interesting things going on there. And he's not among my top picks, Greg, but I can totally see him picking up a piece of this. Let me also go on to one more Breeders' Cup event on Friday, the Juvenile Turf, and I kind of teed this up already. I think my boy Prince can wire this race. I think he's actually quite likely to do so. I mean, a mile at Santa Anita, you want to have speed in these races, especially with a large field. You want to save ground, and he's going to get that kind of trip. His summer stakes, I think, is a lot better than maybe he got credit for at the time. Number one, he had a shoe mishap before the race, and he had to be reshoed in the paddock. Some horses respond very negatively to that, especially a young, lightly raced 2-year-old. Some of them are a little uncomfortable. Some of them get upset. He was professional throughout and ran his race in spite of it. And also, that was a race, while it doesn't have any red color-coded pace figures, the pace really did fall apart in that summer, and the horse that finished around him, Carson's Run and Go with Gusto, they were last and second to last early, and the other horses involved in that pace were absolutely nowhere at the end. I know he beat nothing last time, but boy, he looked great winning that lower level stakes in Woodbine. So I think my boy Prince is one of the more likely winners of this race, and I don't think he's going to be favored. Greg, I'm going to throw it over to you to get Saturday kicked off, because I think you probably have more to talk about than I do.
Yes, for sure. And I like your pick there. He's certainly a horse I'll be considering strongly. I'm a big fan of speed, so you don't have to convince me twice when it comes to a horse likely to have an easy lead. I'll just run through. I have 6 horses in no particular order who I think I set a cutoff of 8-1 when I was going through. Maybe it was double digits. And actually, I should say 7 horses because 2 in 1 race. Not sure which way I'll go. But I'll start with the Breeders' Cup Dirt Mile. And a horse I find intriguing is Drawn to the Inside, Stage Raider. Uh, he's a horse who I just think is a lot better than he looks. On paper, he's been in races with nothing but blue fractions. He draws a good inside post. He's going to have unfortunately, there's not a lot of speed in here again, so I would have to be hoping something lucky happens. But I think he's a horse who's going to run well and possibly run a career best speed figure. And I just think he's one that I want to use in verticals, so he'll be on my tickets. Um, Let me make sure I got this right, filly and mare turf, a horse I'm really interested in, while fully admitting Inspiral is the horse to beat and will be very tough, is the horse just to her outside, Lindy. She was a horse that I really liked last time out. I liked her debut win at Kentucky Downs. I think there's a real argument to be made that she was better than Maj in the QE2 Cup at Keeneland. And she's just a horse who's getting better. She's still just a 3-year-old. I think she should get some pace in here, and a horse that I really think is going to offer some value and might be overlooked. Another horse I wanted to mention, and yet is another filly going to the Breeders' Cup Mile, and that's Gina Romanica. And she was a horse I absolutely did not like last time in the First Lady. I think she actually cost me the pick 4 when she won, if memory serves. But that said, I don't think that was a fluke. I'm not sure what took her a while to get going this year. She wasn't very impressive in her first 2 starts, but she was a filly who was very good as a 3-year-old. She kind of got a late start on turf that year as well after an abbreviated dirt campaign she was just okay. And I just really liked what I saw. I liked the good inside draw. I think she'll be ready. She's shown way back on the pace projector. I don't really agree with that. That's mostly because she's been running in longer races with slower paces. But I think she'll do just fine. I think she has good tactical speed. So that's the first half of the ones I like. I'll turn it back to you just for a minute so I can catch my breath.
Well, I'm going to pick up with the same race that you were just talking about, Greg, because I haven't finished, as I said, I have not finished picks for Saturday. I still have a lot of work to do on Saturday. But one horse that I know I'm going to have in there somewhere, whether he's my top pick or not, is in the mile, the number 3 Casa Creed, who we already talked about being a little further up on the pace projection than maybe we were expecting. And it just feels like this is a horse that's going to get a little bit lost with so many of the sexy runners coming in from Europe and so many people fascinated by Maj out of the QE2. And, I don't know what price he's going to be, but I feel like he'll be every bit of that 8-1 in this race. Like Gina Romantica, I love the inside draw for him. He's a horse that tends to run really well when he can save ground in his races, and too often it feels like he gets caught outside with wide trips. That doesn't feel like it's going to be the case here. Luis Saez has been a little bit more aggressive on him this year, and I feel like it's been a really good fit, and he still produced that finish. And I know that this horse has not been able to produce in some of the biggest stages before. He's tried the Breeders' Cup Mile in the past. I mean, you go back and watch his Breeders' Cup Mile in 2021. He got a ridiculous wide trip that day. He's better than he's shown in some of these races, and I feel like he might finally get the trip he needs in a big spot like this on Saturday. So I don't know if he's my top pick yet. I haven't committed, but I'm going to have Casa Creed in there for sure.
Yeah, I've got no problem with Casa Creed. And I considered putting him on the list, but I think he didn't quite make my cutoff, if I remember. But he has the figures to win. He gets a good draw. Like you, I've seen some chatter. He just doesn't run well in the Breeders' Cup. I dismiss that. I think he's had pretty rough trips both times. Once was in the turf sprint at 5.5 furlongs, which is too short even for him, I would say. So no issues at all with Casa Creed. A horse I like a bit in the Breeders' Cup Turf is I think at some point I'll actually be surprised if a Japanese horse doesn't win one of these races. Don't know which one it'll be, but one horse I'm looking for is Shariar, a horse, and when you look at his last race, he just has no reason to be here. But there's some news circulating. I saw it yesterday. He had some breathing issues and he had a minor surgery to correct it and has been like a new horse since. And when you dig back through this horse's PPs, I mean, he is a runner. He's got some real form and some real class. And even though this is a strong field, I think he's just as good at some of these as his best. And I think he's going to be a real price that could get overlooked because of some of the name power in here.
Oh, totally. Shariar is easy to make a case for if you can dismiss that last race. And it was also run over a turf course that had some give in it. And in Japan, the horses are accustomed to running over very hard, firm ground. And when they do get rain, it can kind of mess up those courses a little bit. And some of them don't handle it. And he was never in that race last time. There were others in that same race that had higher profiles that just did not perform. If you can get beyond that, I mean, this horse won the Tokyo Yushun, the Japanese Derby, going back a couple of years. He won the Dubai Shima Classic months after Yabir won the Breeders' Cup Turf and beat that horse fair and square. So he's got the quality to be this kind of runner. And like you said, I mean, if they've corrected whatever issues he was having so far this year, he's a dangerous type.
Yeah, he just has a lot of quality, and like we said, there's this may be the best Breeders' Cup Turf we've seen in quite some time, and I just have a feeling he might get overlooked and even go off longer than that 15-1 morning line. I'll move to the Breeders' Cup Classic, and there's actually a couple horses I'm interested in here. One will be a fairly big price, and one will be a giant price. And it's just because I just don't have a lot of faith in the horses who are going to be the favorites. Normally, I might be tempted to bet Saudi Crown as a horse I think could just go wire to wire, but I just am not sure he really wants a mile and a quarter. The connections even had doubts they were even going to run it on this day, let alone this race. So I'm a little bit against him. Arabian Night doesn't get the juices flowing as the morning line favorite. So I'm looking at some horses that could come from off the pace. Now, most of the year, I was under the assumption that I would like a 3-year-old in this race, and the really long shot that I am considering I'll get to next. But a horse I think you got to give a long look to is Zandon, who it looks like he finally put things together last time. And I agree, it was not against a very strong field. I mean, he beat Film Star, he beat Law Professor, grade three horses, I would say at best. But it just seems like he always shows up and runs his race. Maybe he's got questions at a mile and a quarter too, but I could see this being a race where the pace really heats up. Um, I think that would be to his liking, and I just think he's going to get completely overlooked in the wagering. He's 12-1 morning line, and I think he's got a real shot to run first or second in here. The other horse who would be a bit more of a stretch is Dreamlike, the Todd Pletcher trained 3-year-old who comes out of a narrow loss to Saudi Crown. And I just kept going back and watching that Pennsylvania Derby, and I kept coming away with it thinking he was probably the best horse in there that day. He took a giant step forward on the Timeform US speed figures. He should get some pace in here. He's a horse who likes to come from off the pace, and it just seems like it took him a while to get things together. Two back, he just had a terrible start in an allowance race. So uh, he ran without blinkers for the first time, I think, since early in his career last time. And he just seemed like a new horse to me. The one concern I have is that maybe he just likes an off track, because you could argue the two best races in his career have come over off tracks. But I'd like to think it was a little more than that. And he's a horse who's going to be a huge price that I think will be closing best of all in this field.
Well, Craig, I'm not going to comment on any of what you just said right now. I will just say, everybody, we are recording our classic preview that you can access on DRF's YouTube channel in a little bit, and I will have formulated my thoughts in the 2 hour break we have between now and then to better respond to Craig. So go and check out that video when it gets posted inevitably by Wednesday. Let's before we wrap up, Craig, let's discuss the race that we kind of just by chance have skipped over completely, and that's the Turf Sprint, which is, of course, race 10 on Saturday after the Classic. I didn't bring this one up with regard to the pace scenarios, and maybe I should have, because while it's still hard to read with some Euros in here, it does feel like one of the Europeans living the dream might be fast enough to outrun everybody to the lead. And I've got to say, this race does not have as much speed in it as I was expecting it would attract.
No, I agree. And I actually have one more horse, and it's in this race. So I'm glad you mentioned this one. I have no problem with living the dream. He's a horse who is very fast. I do have a little concern that even though it was a longer distance, he really collapsed last time when he did get some pressure early. I don't know who's going to pressure him early here. I suspect he'll get some from some of the horses, either Caravel or No Bows. They're both No Balls. They're both horses who like to go to the front end. So I suspect there will be some. And the horse I really want to use, particularly on vertical tickets, because I think he almost has to be in there, is the one horse Big Invasion, cutting back to 5 furlongs. He comes out of that race at Woodbine in the Arctic where he won, I think it was a 7 or maybe even 8 horse photo. It was pretty crazy. But what struck me there was all the other horses came from even behind him. He was the closest to the pace of all the horses there at the finish. He was able to hold them all off. And last night when I saw he drew the one post, it really made me happy because I just see him getting a good ground stalking trip from Joel Rosario. I know that's a very tough rider to trust. But I know what kind of ride I'm going to get. He's going to sit on the rail. He's going to save every inch of ground. He's going to try to pick up the pieces late. And at a big price, I'm willing to take the chance that Joel can find a little of that magic that he sometimes does and often has in the past.
Yeah, I think both Christophe Clement horses are really interesting in this race. Big Invasion for all the reasons you said, and also his Roses for Deborah, the number 9. I mean, I'm happy that she's able to be in this race despite losing that prep last time. That's a race you just draw a line through of a yielding turf course that might be the only race I've ever seen that had a track condition rating of 1 in Timeform US. The turf course is playing that slowly that day. So that doesn't matter. Roses for Deborah looked like she was ascending the ladder to be this kind of runner over the summer, and we never got to find out against males in the prep race, but Craig, I mean, she doesn't look that dissimilar to the way Caravel looked coming into this race last year, and I'm not so convinced that any of these favorites are that reliable at this level that a new face can't shake things up a little bit. And I don't know if she's going to be 12-1. I kind of find it hard to believe that she could be 12-1 or that Big Invasion could be 15-1, but I also have no idea how they're going to bet this race because it looks so evenly matched and jumbled. So, I mean, everybody's going to be some kind of price, and I think she's super interesting.
Yeah, I saved her just for you. I certainly considered her as well. She's one that will be on my tickets for all the reasons you mentioned. I did have a laugh. I had my mic muted. I had not noticed that that track was rated a 1. I've definitely never seen that before. It's one I just put the track variant that we applied to the speed figure and it gets calculated what the track condition rating will be. So that's pretty funny. But yeah, I think this race is pretty wide open. I was a little surprised they made Living the Dream the morning line favorite, albeit a very lukewarm one. But it's going to be an interesting race, and I think you would be foolish to take short prices in here because it looks pretty wide open to me.
Yeah, I don't agree with some things on the line for this race, but I do think Living the Dream could be favored in here. I just think I think there's just a consensus feeling around his last race that he ran the kind of race that's going to make him really dangerous at 5 furlongs. And I think there is some validity to that, but I also don't know if he's the kind of horse I'd want to take as the favorite in this race, given the fact that he still kind of has to do it in this country. But he is a likable horse based on his last couple of efforts and kind of where he came from. So Craig, I think we can sort of wrap it up there. And we've got a lot of other stuff going on this week, as I already said earlier, from the betting strategies to other videos from our other analysts that we're working with. There's a ton of stuff, handicapping content reporting going on at DRF.com. So I think we'll just leave it there. We've gone over the time that I was allotting for this podcast, and we didn't even give out picks in all the races. Some people might be annoyed about that, but I think we covered a lot of ground anyway.
Well, for the record, I do think both of our selections will be appearing in the daily racing form for all of the races.
Correct.
Friday and Saturday. So any races that you missed, you will get to see those and make fun of us for all the races we get horribly wrong.
That's correct. If you're buying the print edition of DRF on either of those days, all of the analyst selections are in there for the Breeders' Cup races, and Craig and I are, I guess, considered analysts for that purpose. Well, Craig, I hope you have a great time out at the Breeders' Cup. You're probably going to see a lot of people. You don't get to see that often, so enjoy it, and I hope the racing action is great for you.
Yeah, I'm really looking forward to it. And my first order of business is I get to go have lunch with my figure making assistant, who shall remain nameless because nobody knows him anyway. But I'm looking forward to it. So yeah, that'll be the first start. I'll get to meet many of the DRF people, including Chloe and Lucia, who do these shows for us every week, and many others who I either have met in the past or have not, but know them through online. So really looking forward to it.
Well, everybody, thanks for tuning into the podcast this week. Craig and I will, of course, be back next week to recap all of the Breeders' Cup races and the action happening this weekend. So I'm sure we'll have an action-packed episode of the TimeformUS Pacecast next week, but that still is of 7 days away. Between now and then, I wish everybody luck playing the races and just taking in all the action at the Breeders' Cup this weekend. Good luck to you.